Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a massive, fascinating piece of history. We're looking at the 74-year lifespan of the USSR. It's a story defined by a literal paradox, achieving these monumental leaps in scientific and industrial progress, while at the very same time subjecting its own citizens to, frankly, devastating oppression.
Think about the sheer scale here for a second. We're talking about a nuclear superpower covering over 22 million square kilometers. They commanded thousands of nuclear weapons and were an absolute global powerhouse. But then, in 1991, it's just gone. It vanished from the map almost overnight. So how exactly does an empire that massive just disappear?
Well, here is our roadmap to figure that out. We'll start with how ideology met the revolution, look at the progress forged by oppression, then hit the satellites, thaw, and stagnation era. After that, we'll cover the reforms and the unraveling, and wrap up with the fatal August coup.
All right, let's dive right into Section 1, Ideology Meets the Revolution, the Seeds of a Socialist State.
The whole ideological foundation here was Marxism-Leninism. Now, Karl Marx obviously provided the critique of capitalism, but it was Vladimir Lenin who actually adapted it to fit autocratic Russia. Back in his 1902 pamphlet, What is to be Done, Lenin essentially argued, hey, a spontaneous worker movement just isn't going to cut it. He insisted that you needed a highly disciplined, completely secret, and centralized vanguard party, basically professional revolutionaries, to actually lead the working class. Fast forward to 1917, and Russia is absolutely buckling under World War I, widespread poverty, and extreme autocratic oppression. In February, massive strikes actually force Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate. A fragile provisional government steps in, but they just can't stabilize things. So October 1917 rolls around, and Lenin and his Bolsheviks execute a swift coup, totally seizing power. After a brutal civil war, by December 1922, the USSR is formally proclaimed. The world's first socialist state is officially on the map.
Which brings us to Section 2, Progress Forged by Oppression, the Stalinist Era.
After Lenin dies, Joseph Stalin takes control. In his era, it's defined by this incredible, immense paradox. On the one hand, you have staggering progress. He takes a largely agrarian peasant society and transforms it into an industrial and military powerhouse, which, as we know, ultimately led to the victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. But on the flip side, the human cost is just unimaginable. His forced agricultural collectivization policies caused massive, devastating famines in the early 1930s. Famines so deadly, he actually suppressed the 1937 census just to hide the sheer death toll.
And to maintain that absolute grip on power, the state weaponized its judiciary. We see figures like Andrei Vyshinsky deeply involved in this system of extreme terror. To put the scale of this into perspective, during the peak of the Great Purge between 1936 and 1938, the secret police killed over 600,000 citizens. They were wiping out anyone even perceived as a threat. And that's not counting the millions more who were vanished into the Gulag forced labor camps. Following Stalin's death in 1953, we enter a totally new phase. Section 3. Satellites, Thaw, and Stagnation, the post-Stalin USSR.
Okay. Picture October 4th, 1957. The USSR launches Sputnik 1, sending that incredibly famous metal sphere into orbit on an intercontinental ballistic missile. It was the world's very first artificial satellite, marking an absolute zenith of Soviet technological progress. I mean, this single event instantly kicked off the space race and dealt a massive prestige blow to the United States. It proved, without a doubt, what Soviet capabilities look like on the global stage.
Meanwhile, back at home, the new leader Nikita Khrushchev kicked off what's known as the Khrushchev Thaw. He actively eased up on that harsh Stalinist repression. The number of political prisoners in the gulags dropped big time, from around 13 million down to 5 million. He also started this massive housing boom, building cheap residential blocks you might know as Khrushchevkas, moving millions of peasants into the cities. It actually brought this burst of cultural openness where poetry and music flourished, but it didn't last. By the 1970s, that heavily centralized command economy was severely stagnating.
The whole system was basically freezing up. That brings us to Section 4, Reforms in the Unraveling, Gorbachev's Gamble.
So by 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev takes the reins. He looks around and realizes the Soviet economy and political system are, well, failing. To fix it, he rolls out two massive, game-changing reforms. Step 1 is glasnost, meaning openness, which allowed for totally unprecedented freedom of expression and transparency in government. Step 2 is perestroika, or restructuring, basically introducing market principles to modernize the economy. But listen, this was a massive gamble. By loosening that iron grip, he didn't just reform the system. He inadvertently gave the republics the wiggle room to start demanding total independence.
And that push for independence spread like wildfire, fueled by a series of absolute catastrophes. You have the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986, and the government's initial instinct to cover it up totally shattered public trust. Then there's the decade-long military intervention in Afghanistan, ending in failure, with 15,000 Soviet soldiers dead. On top of that, the economy was in ruin. We're talking inflation skyrocketing over 300%, and food shortages so bad that people were standing in line for hours, literally just to get a loaf of bread.
The empire was incredibly vulnerable now, leading us right to the climax. Section 5. The fatal August coup. 3 days that killed the Union.
By August 1991, everything hits a breaking point. Communist hardliners are terrified because Gorbachev is about to sign a new Union treaty that would decentralize Soviet power away from Moscow. So, to stop it, on August 18th, they placed Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation home in Crimea. The very next day, this Gang of 8 declares a state of emergency in Moscow. But honestly, it was incredibly poorly organized. Just 3 days later, by August 21st, the whole coup completely collapsed.
And it collapsed mostly because the plotters totally underestimated the people. You had Russian President Boris Yeltsin literally standing on a tank outside the parliament, rallying massive civilian resistance. Thousands of people are out building barricades in Moscow. But you know what the real turning point was? Military commanders flat out refused to follow the hardliners' orders. They secured the nuclear launch codes, and they point-blank refused to fire on their own citizens. Right then and there, the Central Soviet government lost its very last shred of authority. That failed coup was the final nail in the coffin. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev officially resigned. The Soviet Union dissolved into 15 newly independent nations. The red flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, marking the definitive end of the Cold War.
So that brings us to our final thought for today. What exactly is the enduring legacy of this 74-year experiment? I mean, how do we measure a state that launched humanity into space and defeated fascism, yet also engineered systems of profound human tragedy and oppression? It's a deeply complex, multi-layered history for sure, but understanding it is absolutely crucial to grasping the geopolitical borders and tensions we see in the world today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep digging into the past to understand the present. See you next time.